Everything has gone wrong, but not in the way I'd expected it to. Clearly, it wasn't as bad as it could have been since I'm alive and here to type this up, but still far less than ideal. For starters, I got taken below the mounds on the day I was supposed to go with Deirdre to escort the last soul to the other side. If you're not familiar with what Orion Pest Control services are, it may help to start here. Orion had a call for a raccoon that was trying to make a nest in someone's garage. Nothing too spectacular, just a run-of-the-mill garbage kitty looking for somewhere warm for the winter. All that needed to be done was to set a trap, which we'd accomplished when the client called 3 days prior, and pick up the cage when it took the bait. Tell Yins what though, the little jagoff was not thrilled about it. It screeched and reached its paws out to try to grab my hand every time I moved the cage. It's genuinely impressive how much rage those things can store into their tiny bodies. All that was left to do was release the angry little shit into the woods. On another note, it's been getting frigid out here lately. With how much time I spend outside or in poorly insulated areas, I've been needing to wear layers. Case in point, when I journeyed deep enough into the forest to release the little menace somewhere more suitable for it, my breath was visible. Crack. Apprehensively, I glanced over my shoulder, placing my free hand on Ratcatcher's hilt. The noise had come from behind me. However, when I turned, nothing was there. No birds were chirping. Everything around me was still. Even the raccoon had gone quiet. All bad signs. Slowly, I bent down to set the cage on the ground, listening. Whatever it was, it didn't want to be noticed. With one hand, I undid the latches on the raccoon's prison, giving it the chance to run free before whatever was stalking me decided to come out of hiding. There was the slightest crunch as my invisible stalker shifted its weight. It was closer than I'd anticipated. On the off chance it wasn't dangerous, I didn't immediately strike at it. The last thing I wanted was to slice someone or something open that didn't mean me any harm. Instead, I waited for it to make a move. "Please show yourself," I commanded sternly. For a solid 5 minutes, we both stood completely still, it blatantly refusing to come out of hiding, me cautiously waiting. I tried to be patient. Really, I did. I even tried coaxing it back out again to no avail. Eventually, that patience ran out. When I marched over to the copse where it had concealed itself, the first thing I saw was light hair. A human? It launched itself at me. Out of reflex, I swung Ratcatcher, but when I saw its face, I diverted my attack. My face. It was wearing my face. At least, it was supposed to be me, but it hadn't quite gotten it right yet. The features were still sliding into place. Everything appeared to be too loose and somewhat lumpy. I'm not a looker by any stretch of the imagination, but at least I don't look like I'm made of papier-mâché. The eyes were all wrong, too. Black voids encapsulated my sockets with no separation between the pupil or iris. One was also significantly larger than the other, the left roughly the size of a golf ball, the right as small as a marble. I'd never seen a replacement in the midst of a transformation before, and I'm not in any hurry to see it again. There was a strange smell in the air. Fungal. Earthy. Quickly, I found myself becoming dizzy. Alarmed, I held my sleeve over my nose and mouth, trying not to inhale while simultaneously trying to keep the replacement back with the sword. Abandoning the cage, I hastily retreated. My sleeve wasn't enough. The world had begun to tilt. The replacement simply ambled after me, the resemblance between us becoming more and more uncanny with each passing minute. "You're making a mistake." My shout was muffled as I tried to cover my airways. I was even more unnerved to discover that it had already mastered my cadence perfectly when it spoke. Am I? Replacements, as the name implies, are the ultimate identity thieves. They find someone to abduct into the mounds with the intent to disguise themselves as their victim in an effort to take over the unfortunate individual's life. Ordinarily, they seem more inclined to take children. There is a lot of speculation as to why this is, one of them being that replacements want to be cared for by loving parents. Though, it should also be mentioned that there are records of replacements taking the place of children in abusive homes in order to terrorize the poor kids' tormentors. I have to wonder if another reason why they may gravitate towards kids is because it's easier. No bills, no jobs, no real worries, besides making sure mom doesn't catch you reading Percy Jackson by flashlight past your bedtime. I wouldn't necessarily say adult abductions are rare. They just aren't quite as common. Like I said, grown-ups are more difficult thanks to all of the responsibilities and expectations of adulthood. It can be a tall order for a neighbor that doesn't know much about human life to figure out all at once. On top of that, people are also more likely to notice drastic personality changes in adults more than children, which adds to the complexity. From what I can tell, taking over an adult's life seems to be a bragging right for these neighbors. I could imagine that impersonating a pest control specialist would be an even more impressive feat for them. Shaking my head against the spins, I tried to reason with it. My coworkers will know that something's up, and you would not like my boss when he's angry. Thanks for your concern, but I can manage, the Not Nessa said in a bored tone of voice that made me regret not slicing it initially. I held on to consciousness, stumbling a bit as I failed to get any distance on the replacement. I took a swipe at it, but with how the fungal shit in the air was affecting my vision, the blade was nowhere close to finding its mark. My next attempt was equally as clumsy. At that point, I was seeing double. The ground came up fast and suddenly, bruising my rear end. But despite knowing that I was about to be dragged into the mounds, I had started to laugh. A hysterical, empty sound that made my stomach hurt. Was I giddy from whatever I was breathing in? That would make the most sense. Then the world spiraled into darkness, and that was that. When my eyes opened, I was greeted by purple flowers, the same shade as the sky when the sun sets in winter. Their dense, spiky petals looked like nothing I'd ever seen before. Along with that, the plant stems were a bizarre shade of blue. Poking between the canopy of petals above me, the sky above glittered. But it was strange. The constellations were wrong. Ursa Major should have been visible right above my head. As my eyes focused on what I'd originally thought to be stars, I discovered that the violet and silver lights far above me were moving. For a moment, I was baffled, convinced that this was a byproduct of huffing whatever mycotic fumes the replacement had been producing. No matter how many times I blinked or where I looked, the shimmers continued to shift gently like the waves of a calm sea. It was then that I knew where I was. The mounds. Even before the fear settled in, breathing was difficult. The air felt heavier and more sparse, as if there wasn't enough of it to go around. At first, I thought it was another potential side effect. I sat up, hoping that would help get more oxygen into my lungs. It didn't. Once upright, I found that I was laying in a field. Rows upon rows of those strange flowers stretched as far as I could see along the landscape's rolling hills. The only landmark in sight was a massive tree. It stood tall and crooked, its branches plumed with broad white petals that fluttered gently in the wind. But how could there be wind? I was below the ground, wasn't I? Something hung from the tree, swaying languidly with the breeze. With the shock of my circumstances, it took a moment for it to register that it was a body dangling from a noose. Not just one. 4 more undulated in the wind. Humans. They were humans. I'm confident about that. Neighbors wouldn't have any reason to disguise themselves down there, especially not in death. I need to get out of here right now. Shaking, I looked around before rising to my feet, praying that whatever had strung those poor souls up wasn't nearby. To my knowledge, I was alone, save for the canopy of shimmers far above me. Whatever they were, they didn't seem concerned about me in the slightest. Quickly, I took inventory. The Not Nessa had taken my tool belt and sword as well, most of my clothes, leaving me down to the long johns, socks, and long-sleeved shirt I'd been wearing beneath everything else. It even took my fucking hair tie. Good thing I was wearing layers. Piece of shit probably would have left me there nude otherwise. Okay, need to find a crossroads. Just stay calm and think. Was there a road nearby? All I could see were flowers and that damned tree. The 2 largest hills nearby included the one the tree sat on, and one a bit further away in the opposite direction. Maybe one of them could give a better vantage point. The thought of going near the hanging tree made me even more nervous, so I decided to trust my gut and begin walking towards the hill in the opposite direction. Unlike our world, it was warm. At least I wouldn't have to worry about freezing to death, especially when I had so many other things to be afraid of down there. Things like the Dullahan and other more powerful ancient things that normally don't bother gracing the surface with their presence. I've technically been below the mounds before this moment. The church where I'd found the mechanic's name. The cabin Briar had taken me to where Iolo announced he was going to make me a hero. However, it was awesome in the truest sense of that word to be loose in their world, to truly see it. Horizons that I thought could only be glimpsed in dreams. While walking, I kept my eyes and ears honed for any sign of movement. For the moment, the wind was the only other thing moving through the field. Meanwhile, in the back of my mind, a multitude of frantic thoughts fought to be the one that frightened me the most. What if I was nowhere near a crossroads? What if Deirdre went ahead and did her escort, not knowing that I wouldn't be meeting her like I was supposed to be? Oh God, what if one of those bastards hurt her while I wasn't around to do anything about it? And holy shit, Iolo is going to kill me when he finds out I lost that sword. Although, I have to admit that the idea of a replacement showing up to training instead of me did cheer me up slightly. Not much, but slightly. If my imposter thought that taking over my life was going to be easy in any capacity, it was in for a rude awakening. It had seemed pretty cocky when it found me in the woods. It had fucked around, and sooner rather than later, it was going to find out. However, with how worried I was for Deirdre, I didn't have much time to spare. For her sake as well as mine, I needed to find a way home. I tried not to think about the possibility that I could end up at any crossroads in the world, not just the one in my little Pennsylvanian village. The replacement could have dropped me off at the Isle of Skye, for all I knew. Panicking wouldn't do any good. Just had to focus on getting to that hill, then go from there. Baby steps. Once I reached the top, I damn near started crying with relief when I saw that there was what appeared to be a dirt road, roughly a quarter of a mile away from my position. A swirling brown ribbon weaving through the flower-covered hills. There was one traveler. Warily, I ducked down, hoping it hadn't spotted me. I can't say what it was. I'd never seen anything like it before, and there was nothing about it in our records. 8 hoofed legs, bent like the letter Z against its pale, fleshy trunk. It had no head that I could see. A bony appendage, tipped with a scythe-like blade extended from its backside, swaying from side to side as it moved. It was quick, too, leaving only a cloud of dust as it disappeared over the horizon. Shuddering, I determined that it would be best to stay off of the road and to follow it from a distance. Yins have no idea how thankful I was that the mysterious animal hadn't seen me. I know that my description of it reads as somewhat unintelligible. The simple fact is that it didn't resemble anything I'd ever seen before, neighbor or otherwise. It's difficult to compare it to anything purely because of how uniquely incomprehensible it was to behold. There were bound to be more travelers along the way, and I was fairly certain that I didn't want to meet any of them, especially not that one. As I traveled through the mounds, I was treated to many other otherworldly sights, all of them unforgettable. After experiencing them for myself, I can see why so many people have gone mad after being taken here, though I want it to be known that they weren't all horrific. At one point, I heard the thudding of hooves. Lots of them. Fearing that it could be that thing I'd attempted to describe earlier, I hid amongst the flowers. However, it wasn't some bizarre tangle of legs and blades. It was a procession. There was a herd of them, all on horseback. The riders were tall, lanky humanoids, all wearing black hoods that concealed their visages. All of the figures save for the regal-looking neighbor at the front of the group had their heads down. A few of them wept, reaching up to wipe at their eyes and cover their mouths to stifle sobs. In the back of the procession was a cart pulled by 2 horses. Upon the carriage sat a glass coffin, accented with what looked to be blown glass roses. What appeared to be a beautiful woman lay inside, her arms folded across her chest. White flowers were woven into her hair, making it appear that she'd merely fallen asleep in a meadow. As the procession passed, I was in awe. In their bereavement, they paid me no attention. They were entirely focused on getting the fallen neighbor to her final destination. For the briefest moment, I was distracted from my own distress as I wondered who the lady in the coffin was to have such funerary rites afforded to her. Along with that came the macabre contemplation of how such a neighbor could have perished. The incredible sight was ruined when I heard a crow's call. I was glad that I was already in hiding when I saw a murder of them pass overhead in their mangled forms that ordinarily can only be seen with a hagstone or a clover. For one moment, I'd completely forgotten that the wild hunt was still a threat down there. Possibly even more than they were up above, without Iolo's possessiveness to shield me from their nightmarish impulses. Silently, I hoped that the crows didn't notice me. They didn't linger, so I convinced myself that I was safe for the time being. As I continued onwards, I kept an eye on the skies as well. More time passed. I heard its approach long before I saw it. Screams, a chorus of them. The shrill, guttural cries that make your marrow freeze and muscles tense. Once again, I hid. The ground shook, the tremors intensifying as the source of the shrieks drew nearer. For good measure, I covered my mouth, not wanting to take the chance of whatever was coming to be able to hear me. Whatever it was, it didn't sound friendly. A horned snake, the size and length of a cargo train, darted along the road in swift, whip-like movements. The screams were deafening, making me shrink down even more as the serpent got closer, trying to become one with the earth. Just as it was about to pass by me, it stopped. It raised its massive head, tasting the dense air with its forked tongue. Blood oozed from its sides each time it moved. Occasionally, the scales would shift as the snake glanced around. My heart pounded in my chest as I located the origin of the screams. Tears fell from my eyes as I began to notice what was left of the twisted faces of the souls trapped within the ridges of its mottled scales. One of them reached out only for their arm to get severed by the scale's sharp edges, falling limply to the road. Was it looking for me? One more soul to add to its collection? It sat there, sniffing around for what felt like millennia. Empires rose and fell in the time it took for the snake to continue on its way. In reality, it probably couldn't have been any longer than a minute or two. Even after it departed and I couldn't hear the moans of those imprisoned within its flesh anymore, I didn't dare emerge from where I cowered beneath the flower petals, convinced that it was waiting for me just up ahead. How could something like that exist? It's there now, below our feet, looking for more. And worse yet, what if it's not the only one of its kind? How many are out there? After seeing that, it took far longer than I care to admit for me to find the strength to keep going. Between that serpent and the foul air, I remember thinking that it made perfect sense that so many neighbors wanted to leave the mounds. No wonder they hate us. For what felt like the 1,000th time, I prayed that I'd find a crossroads soon. Ending up in the Siberian wilderness or even in the sixth circle of hell would have been better than there. It may sound dramatic, but being trapped within a flaming tomb seemed a far less agonizing doom than what I'd just witnessed. I just had to keep going. It could always come back. I couldn't count on the flowers to hide me forever. My distance from the road increased afterwards. From that point on, I was too afraid to look too closely at any more of those traveling along it, only sparing glances to ensure that none of them had noticed me. Eventually, the flower fields began to taper off, giving way to waves of lush, golden grass leading to a ravine of looming cedars. That made me even more uneasy. Yins, remember the hunger grass I discussed not too long ago? It could be growing there. I froze, torn between the possibility of encountering a cursed patch of grass and the terrifying prospect of walking on the road. Fuck me. What was I supposed to do? Recalling the snake, I decided that the potential of turning into a starving revenant was the lesser of two evils and stayed the course, trying to convince myself that the crossroads was just up ahead. While failing to avoid stepping on pine cones and fallen needles, I began to wonder how long it had been since the replacement dumped me down there. According to everything I'd read about the mounds, time passes differently there. Someone can disappear for what they believe to be a few weeks, only to re-emerge and find that years had gone by since they'd left. Everyone that they've ever known is now old and gray while they've barely aged a day. To me, it felt like only a few hours had passed since I reached the forest within the mounds, but I couldn't trust that. Could a week have passed? Maybe longer? My mom was getting up there in years. What if I never got to say goodbye to her? What if she died, never knowing what happened to me? where I went. Holding back tears, I forced myself to stop thinking like that. Working myself into hysterics was the last thing I needed to do. I was going to get out. I'd find a crossroads if it killed me. That was when I heard a voice on the wind, one that made my heart race for a completely different reason. One I would know anywhere. Deirdre. She was singing, trying to guide me back. Her song was floating along the breeze, drifting south from the direction I'd been walking. At least, I think it was south. It was hard to tell with no sun or moon to orient myself with. The best way I can think of to describe the lighting down there is that it appeared to be frozen in a perpetual twilight. Dim, yet not to the point of total darkness. After a few moments of following the Weeper's guidance, a thought made me hesitate. What if it was a trick? Could something out there be imitating her? Reaching within me to use the likeness of someone it knew that I trusted? I've encountered a few neighbors capable of that. The gray men come to mind. I didn't doubt that such things lurked in the hills around me. While I deliberated, the distant cawing of crows made me flinch. I glanced towards where I'd heard them, seeing that their dark wings moved in an ominous cloud along the path I'd been taking before I'd heard Deirdre. A hunter was looking for me. Feeling that I didn't have much of a choice after that, I chased her song, hoping that she'd be the neighbor I'd find at the end of this journey. Slowly, steadily, her words became more clear as I began to get closer to her. The mistits mi lamfin, buai na reinich, buai na reinich. I'd heard her sing it before. We were washing dishes together. She'd started with muttering it under her breath until I encouraged her to speak up. Unsurprisingly, the creep next door pounded on the wall. In response, Deirdre had scowled and proceeded to sing at the top of her lungs just to spite him. Despite my circumstances, I chuckled to myself at the memory. That must have been why she chose to use that one. That way I'd know it was her and not some sort of mimicry. Distantly, I heard music playing while I was hurrying along that did not come from her. Laughter could be heard in the same direction. Despite the uplifting, jolly tune of the instruments, I clapped my hands over my ears as I kept walking. I didn't dare seek it out, keeping my gaze low, relying solely on the wind to guide me until the sounds of merriment were no longer audible. Such parties are not meant for humans. Think of the mechanic, how he can lure you in with just a single note from his banjo, make you forget to be afraid before he uses his music to manipulate your mind and body. How with just a few effortless swipes of his fingers, he can destroy you. Now imagine an entire band made up of musicians just like him. Even as the music faded into the background, I couldn't relax afterwards as I kept following Deirdre's gentle guidance. I didn't think the musicians had noticed me, but even so, I was on edge. Without shoes, my feet were beginning to hurt as I stumbled over stones and tree roots. My jaw was aching from being clenched for so long. I absent-mindedly rubbed at it with one hand, trying to loosen up the sore muscles. Caw. Reflexively, I crouched down into the cover of the lower hanging branches of a nearby cedar. The crow's call had been close, far too close for comfort. Stupidly, I found myself wondering if the mounds had ticks. However, Rocky Mountain fever was the least of my concerns. Hooves, the beating of wings overhead. My trembling hand came up to cover my mouth as I became acutely aware of every gap in the branches surrounding me. Please pass by, please pass by, please pass by. A horrible, gravelly voice called out to me, either you can come out, or I can come get you. The choice is yours. I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath. The crows chuckled amongst themselves, settled in the canopy above. No use hiding at that point. All it would serve to do is anger my pursuer, and I didn't have to come out to know who would be waiting for me on the other side of the trees. Steeling myself as best as I could, I slunk out of my hiding spot to meet the white son of mist. While Victor's description of the god of the wild hunt hadn't been inaccurate, mere words can't do him justice. Much like the wilds he commanded, he was sublime, bearing the same terrifying majesty as the path I'd taken to get as far as I did. His head was inclined in the direction of Deirdre's song, as if appraising it, those massive antlers cutting a sharp profile against the glittering imitation of a sky above us. The king of the wild hunt sat astride some sort of beast with ram-like curved horns, standing at the same height as the average draft horse. Its shaggy white fur appeared as if it had just been brushed. The beast watched me with complete disinterest, one of its teardrop-shaped ears twitching judgmentally, as if I was the most unimpressive thing it had ever laid eyes on. Unsure, I gave the white son of mist an awkward bow, not wanting to cause offense, but also uncertain if he expected such gestures from me. Gwyn didn't appear to notice, white eyes following Deirdre's voice, as if he could visualize the words she spoke. He remarked mildly, "She's talented. I'll give her that much." The beast shook its head, as if it disagreed. The god finally deigned to acknowledge me, looking me from head to toe. Somehow, his gaze bore the same chill that can be felt only during the most piercing winter winds. I had the vulnerable urge to cover my chest with my arms, but I resisted it. Gwyn Ap Nudd was the last being to look weak in front of. His smile was sardonic. "We didn't get the opportunity to meet on Callan Gaeth, but I know who you are. Though, truth be told, I'd expected you to be clothed for our first interaction, and armed." I was taken by surprise, I muttered, forcing myself to meet his gaze. Ordinarily, I'd advise against looking a hunter directly in the eye, but according to what Victor had said, it wouldn't make a difference with Gwyn. If he wanted to get into my head, he'd be able to with ease. It was better not to look as timid and squeamish as I felt. Even though I stand taller than most, he gave me the experience of being the same height as a field mouse. "Ah, yes, a changeling," the white son of mist said. "One of the lowest of us. This is a disappointment, Dog of Orion. Given who you're working with, I'd expected you to be capable of defending yourself against such a weak opponent, especially after your victory against the Dullahan." A flare of anger rose in me after that, but I held my tongue. Instead, I diverted back to the way I used to address higher officers while in service. "Yes, sir," I replied humbly. The god's chuckle made the hair on the back of my neck stand as tall as the trees surrounding us. "You were wise not to say what you were thinking, though you'd be even wiser not to harbor such insolence in the first place." I swallowed back panic as I told him, "I won't let it happen again, sir." Even now, as I sit in the relative safety of my home once again, I'm afraid to even consider saying something remotely snarky about him. I feel like he'd know. With one hand on the reins, the white son of mist guided his steed to turn towards where Deirdre had been leading me. "Shall we?" The beast side-eyed me as I walked alongside them both. When Gwyn addressed it, I learned its name was Carngrun. I learned afterwards that it means terror of the field. No kidding. I probably spelled that wrong, by the way. If so, I humbly apologize to the Welsh for butchering your language. What's also interesting about this steed is that in the accounts I've found, it's often described as being a white horse. I wonder if that's how it appears outside of the mounds. Admittedly, I was afraid to speak much during our trek. Hell, I was afraid to think after being admonished earlier. The quiet was tense with only the beast's hooves to fill it. Carngrun snorted at me, though it sounded a bit more like a scoff, a dismissive, rude sound. "He thinks you're being too skittish," Gwyn informed me with a wry smile. I'm inclined to agree. Honesty was appreciated when dealing with the mechanic. Maybe his king would have a similar inclination. "Truth be told, I'm not quite sure how to behave around you. I have no desire to make this journey in silence," he answered. "You can start by remedying that. There's much you're curious about, correct?" I took a deep breath, thinking that the skull Victor found was the most pressing matter to address. I tried to be careful about how I phrased it. "May I ask what your intentions with my company are?" "What knowledge do you have of the hunt, Dog of Orion?" I rattled off everything I thought I knew about the Wild Hunt's purpose, as well as his ongoing war over Cradolad's affection, while trying to address such matters as carefully as possible. Gwyn's expression was stoic as he listened. "I'm sure you've noticed a restlessness among my ranks," he eventually replied. "An inclination for cruelty brought about by boredom. Do you know why this is?" "No, sir. We used to greet warriors into our ranks. We attended great battles to offer the honorable a chance to ride amongst those of their equal, to keep order among the vile. Now we are reduced to butchers, here merely to cull the herd of its most wicked souls. The ones we used to seek out are fewer and further between than ever before." "You've all done well to prove that such strong spirits haven't vanished from your race completely. I don't intend to let that slip from my grasp. Come Judgment Day, those under the leader of Orion's employ will be called to service. He paused to grant me a derisive look. I can feel you beginning to panic. Rather pointless, considering that your fate has been sealed since the beginning. Contrary to popular belief, I am not ungracious. You and yours will be rewarded justly, treated to an afterlife of luxury before the final days, and rest assured, it will be several human lifetimes before that happens. Naturally, being told not to panic had the opposite effect. How could I not? After risking everything to learn Iolo's name, after resisting the Wild Hunt's assault on Samhain and the dead duo barely hanging on by the skin of their teeth, the despair I felt in that moment was overwhelming. The ground felt like it was miles away below my feet. My head pounded. It all meant nothing. Bizarrely, my mind went blank after that. No thoughts, no emotion, nothing. Like a pin popping a balloon, leaving me with only a stark hyper-awareness of the physical world around me. The White Son of Mist said coolly, "If you are unable to keep your composure, I will do it for you. I do not tolerate such defeatism. Is that understood?" All I could do was nod. As quickly as it had happened, the ability to think returned again. My hands shook afterwards. In fact, I think my whole body did, try as I did to control it. Afraid to even consider revisiting that subject, I changed the topic of discussion. The keening woman who sings for me now is an asset as well. "We are in agreement," Gwyn replied, then offered me another smile. "I suppose you're going to ask me to order my captain to spare her?" I'd considered it, but I'd intended to do it with reverence. For starters, I was going to offer you a bottle of vodka. I glanced down at myself in dismay before adding, "And I planned on wearing clothes." The White Son of Mist let out a soft laugh. "I do enjoy a stiff drink on a cold night. I might have looked upon you favorably." "How do you look upon me now?" I asked apprehensively. He considered briefly before telling me, "As of now, I regard you as someone with potential that has yet to be met. The same can be said for your employer, though I must admit I'm more invested in his progress than yours. And I imagine that if the keening woman were to be disposed of, then we could expect more resistance from Orion, and while we could simply force your subservience, it would be preferable to have willful cooperation." Jesus, no, don't think. Stay calm. Are we worth all of this trouble? This time, when the White Son of Mist grinned down at me, there was a trace of humor in it. As I've said, we seek the honorable. While I was expending so much effort trying to keep my mind cleared, it took a moment for me to notice that Deirdre's song had stopped. Sensing my unease, the king chided me. "You can't expect the poor girl to sing all day, can you?" "I guess not," I conceded. A crow settled on the ground by Carngroan, the puppet of the Wild Hunt, slumping under the weight of the patchy wings that had been forced onto it. I didn't want to look at it, but I felt Gwyn's presence as strongly as a bad memory and knew he'd disapprove. They had forced the sharp beak into the former human skull haphazardly, making it so that when its jaws parted, they didn't quite meet up correctly. The skin drooped around its empty eye sockets, wrinkling like the flesh of a rotting apple. It spoke to the king, but I couldn't understand a word of it. "I am needed elsewhere," Gwyn informed me after the crow said its piece. "Another has opted to escort you the rest of the way. I'm sure you can guess who was gracious enough to volunteer." Don't think. I bowed, just as awkwardly as before as I said, "I appreciate that you took the time to take me this far, and for answering my questions." Carngroan snorted again, shaking his head as if to say, "Yeah, you better be grateful." The White Son of Mist merely gave me a nod before they departed. Still trying to keep my mind in check, not sure of the limits of the god's reach, I kept walking in the same direction we'd been heading. I was dreading meeting up with Iolo, but at least around him, I didn't have to worry about thinking the wrong way. Sure enough, after some time had passed, I heard that damned banjo's notes floating through the trees in front of me. Begrudgingly, I followed it, ready to literally and figuratively face the music. However, when I finally came across Iolo, I was surprised to discover that he wasn't alone. He perched on a fallen tree's trunk, claws strumming the strings of his instrument delicately. Deirdre sat across from him, staring forlornly at the ground until she heard my approach. Her face lit up with relief as she jumped from her seat, hurrying over to throw her arms around my shoulders. "When that imposter came home instead of you," she whispered into my hair, "I feared the worst. I trapped it the moment it walked through the door, but then it took us days to." My eyes widened as I gasped. "Days?" Iolo's cool confirmation made me stiffen. "Yup, days. 3 of them, if you were curious, caused quite a ruckus. It had only been a few hours for me. So, about your sword," Iolo started. Despite his cheery tone, I could tell by the subtle bite of his words that he was livid. He stopped playing to reach beside him, producing Ratcatcher. My jaw dropped when I saw that the blade was bent. It more closely resembled a fishhook than a sword. "We used to do this in the old days," he explained darkly, his earlier false friendliness long gone. "You kill a man, you bend their sword to shame him." Shit. I ran a hand through my hair, unable to look away from the blade. It took me by surprise. It released some mushroom stuff that made me pass out. "Well, that's something we're gonna have to work on," he snapped with an aggrieved sigh, also rising to loom over me. "And I'm gonna have to fix this shit now." Without thinking, I retorted, "Allow me to extend my condolences for how difficult my abduction was for you." Deirdre squeezed my shoulder gently. "Not the time. We should leave." Meanwhile, Iolo snickered. "Didn't enjoy your time down here, Fiona?" Deirdre sounded like an underpaid babysitter as she urged us. "Please, can you two bicker along the way? It isn't safe here." "Nah, I said what I needed to. Keweened," Iolo replied. "Less Fiona has some more annoying shit to say. I got it all out of my system." I just shook my head as I marched onward, not taking the bait. Thankfully, there was no more excitement as the pair led me back to our world. The world that is so blissfully boring without giant snakes and massive things with far too many legs. Our world is quite underrated, to be honest. I love it here, and I take back everything I said about Pennsylvania. Somehow, the banjo bastard and I managed not to argue. We made the trip in terse silence, the 3 of us speaking only when necessary. Afterwards, Deirdre filled me in on what happened to the replacement. Once she'd had it trapped, she didn't waste any time in getting a hold of Victor. The boss had interrogated it about my whereabouts, while Raina and Deirdre aided Wes as he worked to track my scent, but to no avail. Then Iolo showed up. The replacement apparently became much more forthcoming after that. When it comes to what I learned to be the destiny of Orion, I'm still terrified to question it. Victor was solemn when I broke the news, but he didn't seem surprised. When it comes to Raina, it gets a little curious, considering that she is fairly religious due to her practices. Will the White Son of Mist have to duke it out with Jesus? Is it sacrilegious to bring such an idea up? Meanwhile, shockingly enough, Wes didn't seem delighted about the prospect of someday being forced to serve the same party that hunted him for sport. "I just simply won't die," he said with a shrug. "Or I'll sell my soul to someone else. Let them sort that out." There's an idea. Any kind. Gentle neighbors out there want some pest control specialist souls? They qualify for the Cyber Monday sale that's going all the way until the 2nd week of December. Get them now while supplies last. Excludes members of the Wild Hunt. So that brings us to Deirdre's last keening session. I am pleased to say that it was relatively uneventful, pleasant even. It was an older man who'd been ready. He hadn't fussed or argued, just followed. Lathanan gras, nisire, tikin huindluth, ashlanair, bontainig thunuas, ashlanair, bontainig thunuas. Once her song was complete, I stared at her in anticipation, but honestly, I don't know what I expected to happen. For her to be cocooned in sparkles and light like a butterfly? "Is that it?" I asked intelligently. She frowned back at me, brows creased. "I believe so." Experimentally, she removed the canteen from her shoulder. After taking a few moments to prepare herself, she twisted off the cap and inverted the flask. Together, we watched the dirt drink it up. Deirdre paused when it got down to the last drops, flinching and squeezing her eyes shut as she quickly shook them out. Once again, I waited for some dramatic fanfare, or for one of the hunters to find some loophole around what Gwyn had said to snatch her away. But once again, there was nothing. Blissful, wonderful, boring nothing. She slowly raised a hand to my cheek, her frown deepening as she cupped it affectionately. I asked her if she could feel anything. Sadly, she shook her head. "Maybe it'll take some time," I tried to reassure her. "It could be a slow transition back to human." you know? You've been a weeper for decades. She sounded distant as she said, maybe.